Today, we're talking about the biggest questions going into training camp for the Chicago Bulls. And so before we go ahead and we jump into it, I first want to remind you to slam dunk on that subscribe button, just like Modest Buzelis slam dunks in games. And so in exchange for slamming on that subscribe button, I'm going to give you nothing but daily content around the Chicago Bulls. And so make sure that you hit that like, you hit that subscribe, and you join the Chicago Bulls Insider family as we talk nothing but Chicago Bulls basketball. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and let's jump into it as we are talking about the biggest questions for the Chicago Bulls as they head into training camp and media day. And so at the time of this recording, we are 8 days away from the start of training camp, and we're 7 days away from the start of media day. And so let's start with media day. And I think that the biggest question going into media day is going to be around the negotiations between the Chicago Bulls and Josh Giddey. And I think that this is really important to just the start of this season, because we know that the Chicago Bulls really had a great finish to the season last year. And I think in order for them to get off to a good start, they need to have that team chemistry clicking from the start of the season. And I think that this is an important step. And so hopefully the negotiations went well, which we're going to find out from Josh Giddey, and a lot of people really want to know, just how tough these negotiations were. Is he maybe upset if the Chicago Bulls were trying to play hardball? Like, we'll find out all of that. And so, that's going to be important because Josh Giddey is your lead guard. You know that the Chicago Bulls are going to be throwing him the keys to the offense. He's going to be making a lot of decisions out there, and he's got a lot of responsibilities, going forward now after signing this new deal. And so you're expecting that Josh Giddey is going to step up and really lead this team. And so you definitely want your leader to certainly, be in just a good mood here with the organization moving forward. So we will find that out at media day, but I think that this is going to be something that is important as this team starts its season. And so next, as we get into training camp, there's a couple things that I definitely think are going to be like a big question here. And so starting with players that could really be a big surprise for the Chicago Bulls. And so I'm talking about players that either they didn't, get enough playing time last year. They got played out of the rotation, whatever that looked like. And so, starting with a guy like Jalen Smith, or, guys like Dalen Terry, who got some run, but it just wasn't necessarily defined with their role and everything else. But just players that, they showed something. And that goes into yesterday's video, just potential, but they just haven't quite taken that step. And so, I think that training camp is an important step for those players. And I think, look, a player like Jalen Smith, if he can come in and show that, look, he's improved, show he can definitely contribute, in this front court, I think that this is something that Billy Donovan is going to have to consider. And, especially the front office, because if they decide to go ahead and pivot off of Vooch here through the season, then that means that these guys are going to have to step up. And so you need to build some confidence early. Let's see if they come in and they don't approach this thinking like, okay, I didn't necessarily get the minutes last season, but maybe they come in hungry and they're saying, hey, there's a chance that I can really carve out a role here. So let's see if we see that from Jalen Smith. And then also too, before we jump out of that part, just looking at Dalen Terry on the CHGO podcast, man, it sounds like that he's super focused. He is ready to go for this season. Talked about how he just locked himself into the gym and changed his diet. So, man, I'm super excited to just see him come out and compete for a role on this team. And so I think that that is one of the biggest questions that I have coming into training camp is just, can these players carve out a role and just show that they need to get some minutes? And so next, I think another question coming in, and this is something that we've talked about before, it's going to be who's going to start at the small forward position. And so I like Ayo Dosunmu. I think that you can throw Isaac Okoro out there too as well. I totally understand that. Some people have Kevin Huerter out there too. And I just think that that is going to be a great battle. You still have Patrick Williams. You still have Julian Phillips. You still have Dalen Terry, So all those players are going to be in line to start. It's just going to be a major battle. And so I think that that's going to be one of the bigger questions going into this thing. And I'm sure that that's going to be something that's maybe asked to Billy Donovan at media day and really throughout training camp. And so the next thing for the Chicago Bulls, and I think a big question mark going into this, is really what are we going to see from our future players? And so starting with Noa Essengue, and for him, I want to know, is he going to get off to a good start? Does he start to show some of the flashes that we saw early, on in training camp with modest Buzelis last year? Because I do think that he could be in line for a similar type of path this year where Billy Donovan is going to take it slow with him and kind of get him into a situation where it's like, okay, if he shows that he can really contribute to this team, especially on the defensive end, then maybe, if a trade is made or something like that, or maybe even if not a trade's made, maybe Billy Donovan decides to go ahead and cut him loose and give him some minutes by the end of the year, just like Modest Buzelis. But I definitely think that training camp is going to be very important for Noa Essengue to take that step. And another player that we really haven't talked about as much is going to be Lachlan Olbrich, because he's definitely going to be in the mix, especially if the Chicago Bulls decide to really shuffle it up in the front court, because Vooch may not be the only player on the move. What if they decide to move on from Jalen Smith? I think that if they did and they don't necessarily bring back a front court, then that means that Lachlan Olbrich could have to slide up to the big roster here. And so we know he's going to play a lot in the G League. He does have the two-way contract, but still, I think you have to take Lachlan Olbrich into consideration here. Perhaps that could be something that the Bulls pivot on. And I think that if he comes in and he plays well in training camp and just kind of goes through, preseason as well, this is something that the Chicago Bulls are going to have to think about as they continue to really build out this roster. And then next, I think one of the bigger questions around just what could possibly happen next with a player is going to be Patrick Williams. I think that there's going to be major questions here, because if Patrick Williams doesn't come out well and perform in training camp, I wonder, does the chatter really start about, okay, do you look to move him? You know what I mean? Like, what is that going to look like? Because we know, there's just so much promise that has been around Patrick Williams, but he just has not been able to take the step. And so he could take the step now. I mean, there's a chance that he comes in, he feels great off his foot injuries and things like that, totally focused, and he's just able to seize the moment. And he's a guy that plays himself into a significant role. Or he could do something where, we pretty much have seen this movie before where it just hasn't been consistent. He shows maybe a little promise here, a little promise there. And I just wonder what the Chicago Bulls would do, especially if he gets off to a slow start in training camp. And so I think that that's like one of the bigger questions, kind of going into training camp. And then also to the preseason is just like, what is next for a guy like Patrick Williams, and how might this team possibly pivot? And so, next, and the last point that I want to make is I think that it's going to be interesting to hear what Billy Donovan talks about, because I think in media day, I think a lot of people are going to ask about this offense in year two, because I think that the expectations should be higher. And so you want to hear what he has to say as far as what his expectations are for the offense. And then also too, defensively now, because I think that now when you add Isaac Okoro and then you're getting back Ayo Dosunmu, you do have Patrick Williams, who has shown flashes of defense here. There's a chance that this team can finally find an identity defensively. It's going to be about Billy Donovan mixing up this personnel, getting this group in the right position to succeed, because, you want to have that balance of good offense and obviously good defense in order to win, some significant basketball games. And so I'm not talking about just trending towards the play-in, but I'm talking about taking that next step. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of questions asked to Billy Donovan there. And then lastly, with AK in the front office, I think it's always going to be interesting to hear what he says, if he's going to go ahead and speak at media day, just about how he feels about this roster, what he's thinking, maybe long terms and things like that with possible trades and stuff like that, even though I'm probably sure we're not going to hear very much, from AK, but I definitely think that this is something that is going to get a lot of chatter. And so anyway, you guys let me know in the comments what you guys are thinking as far as some of these bigger, kind of storylines, questions, kind of going into media day, training camp, and just I think towards the start here of just preseason basketball as well. And so once again, we're right around the corner as we have training camp that is set to take place on September 30th. You have media day set to take place on September the 29th. And that is just some dates to note here. And so anyway, you guys let me know in the comments what you guys are thinking. And as we always say, go Bulls, and I will see you guys on the next one. All right, peace.